Good evening. I'm Vivian Schmidt, Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and Director of the Center for the Study of Europe here at BU. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Europe, the Center for the Study of Asia, and BU's Undergraduate Economics Association, I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Costas Lapavitsas. I hope I got that pronunciation right. The event is funded in part by a grant from the European Union Commission delegation in Washington, D.C., and takes place as part of our European Voices series. The series is premised on the notion that ideas originate not in the center in bureaucratic chambers, but on the edges of society, where they are picked up and represented by artists, writers, activists, and in this case, intellectuals, in a manner that sparks public discourse and seeds future politics. Tonight's lecture celebrates the release by Verso books of Profiting Without Producing, How Finance Exploits Us All. The book explores the roots of the recent economic crisis in terms of financialization, the most salient feature of which is the rise of financial profit, and discusses the options available for controlling finance, as well as resolutions to the current crisis, in particular in the Eurozone. The event will be moderated by Cornel Ban, Assistant Professor of International Relations and a specialist in the political economy of crises and transitions. Before I turn the floor over to Cornel, who will introduce our speaker, let me say a few words about the format of our event. Costas will give his presentation, after which we'll have a conversation in which we hope many of you will participate. If you do have a question, please go to the microphone at your side of the room and wait for Cornel to acknowledge you. The event is being recorded and videotaped for the web, so please introduce yourself before asking your question and kindly keep your questions brief. Please also take a minute to silence your cell phones. Oh, very good. I can see that actually made a difference in terms of the announcement. So we'll take about 90 minutes, but I hope the conversation will continue informally at our reception and book signing, to which you're all, of course, cordially invited. So thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. We're very fortunate to have Professor Lapavitsas here with us from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. A couple of words about our presenter. It would be fair to call you a heterodox economist, I suppose, and I see your work as being a very interesting combination between Marxian and post-Keynesian understandings of finance. But before you wrote on finance, basically established your name as somebody working in issues of finance and development, particularly on Asia and the Japanese financial sector in particular. Those of you who are interested in aspects relating to industrialization in developing areas, Professor Lapavitsas has written extensively on the connection between industrialization and finance. On settings as different as the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Macedonia, as well as the East Asian countries and their historical experience. So I would say finance and development, the structure of financial systems, as well as finance and industrialization would be the critical elements of your career in this regard. So in addition to being a post-Keynesian plus Marxist economist, I think that your work is unique in terms of the fact that it takes very seriously the social embeddedness of economics. So it's a very interdisciplinary approach that takes history seriously, takes sociology seriously, and engages with politics seriously. Including the very baroque elements of European political and economic integration. So it's a deeply historical work, very socially sensitive, and your work more recently during the crisis, which has been quite dense, engages with a very critical and harrowing question: and how can we make finance work for us all better than it does right now? And you set the bar very high there. This is not going to be a reformist, run-down-the-mill kind of approach. This will be a challenging set of diagnoses as well as prognosis about what to do about it. I will make 2 points about the book. I think at the core of it lie two concerns. The first is that what we have seen since 2008 has been the manifestation of a structural crisis. This is not a contingent event. Rather, it has been at the core not only of the financial sector and it's the financialization of many private and public goods that has been taking place during the past few decades, but has also been at the core of politics itself. The second aspect is that the underlying contradictions built into financialization overlap with the contradictions of the European political integration project. And that's a very challenging proposition that has been engaged with very empirically in your book. There are two aspects of these contradictions. One is the relationship between core and periphery, between the wealthy north and the sort of quote-unquote poor south, and the sort of contradictions embedded in the European monetary integration project. But there's also an internal one that revolves around class relations. At the end of the day, you are a Marxian who takes class seriously, but the imbalance that is embedded in this kind of internal class contradictions lies at the core of your analysis, and that I think is an approach that we don't see every day. Not only that we don't see a heterodox economist on a North American campus every day, but we see one that has his own take on it, and that kind of intellectual hybrid that you propose, I think is going to be one that will get a lot of ideas flowing around the room. Without much further ado, Costas Lapavitsas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It's very unusual for me. Where I come from and where I work, things pan out differently on a daily basis. But anyway, I'd like to thank you for this very kind opening. And I'd also like to thank the Center for the Study of Europe and thank Boston University for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. I came to Boston, I've only been here once before. It was a pleasure trip then. Still is a pleasure now, but the pleasure is different because I come to address you, so I hope to have intellectual give and take. I will discuss financialization, what it is in my view and what to do about it. I will do it in a Greek accent that has been honed in England. So if you're taken aback by the mixture of English sounds and Greek sounds, then it's because of what you get here. So let's see how it works out. I'll do it as slowly as I can, but you can rest assured that my Greek side will come out after about 20 minutes and I will start speaking faster and faster. If you've got difficulty, let me know and I'll slow down. Now, I don't really want to waste any more time, so I'll get on with it. And I'll start with a simple observation, which we can all share. I don't think there's any doubt at all about it, that in modern, mature capitalist economies, the US being one of the leading ones, but not only that, the UK, Germany, Japan, and so on, France, there's an extraordinary presence of finance now. The presence of finance today and over the last 3 to 4 decades has become simply extraordinary. Finance, the financial sector, but finance generally, has become enormous in terms of size relative to GDP and so on. In terms of the penetration of financial transactions and financial considerations and financial activities throughout economic and social life, and also in terms of policy influence, the shaping of policy, to which I will come back in a minute, is influenced by the concerns of the financial system and the financial sector. So I don't think there's any doubt at all about that. That's, in a sense, it's a dumb fact. The finance has become extraordinarily important. Therefore, I think it's a fair call to say that mature capitalist economies have become financialized. Let's agree on the term, on a sort of casual use of the term, a heuristic use of the term to start with. So we've got financialization right here in front of us, but obviously there is no agreement on how to understand it. The term is becoming more and more popular, more and more widely used, but what is it? So I'll give you my take. What's going to happen here is I'm going to give you my take, and this take I've developed over some time, and you'll find it in this book of mine. So what is financialization? Well, let me come clean and tell you at the outset that I think that financialization represents a structural change of contemporary capitalism. It's basically a historic transformation of the capitalist system if one takes a longer-term perspective. If you want to use an old-fashioned political economy Marxist term, I think it's an era, right? It's an era of capitalist development that basically commenced about 4 decades ago. Like all eras, it didn't become obvious when it started. No one can actually locate these things very easily when they start. They become clear with hindsight. And I think it became clear with hindsight at the end of the previous decade, basically. So if you ask me again, I would say that the term that most appropriately captures what's happened to global capitalism the last 4 decades is not really globalization. I know the term is used extensively, and I use it myself. I don't think really it is globalization, a term which I've never quite understood with enough precision. I would say that really what's happened to global capitalism the last 4 decades is financialization. I think that's the term that really could potentially capture better the transformation of capitalism in recent decades. So then how to identify it? If that's the case, how to identify it? Now, that's a difficult thing to do. It's no wonder that there is no agreement, because that's inherently a very difficult thing to do if one moves beyond the simple recognition of the size of finance. So how to identify it, how to think about it? Well, in my view, it should partly be done in theoretical terms. You partly need theory. You need to identify changes, real processes taking place in capitalist accumulation that can help you understand and define financialization. That's the first thing that has to happen. In a sense, that's economics and political economy. Okay? But that alone is not enough. We've got to start with that, but that alone is not enough. We also need to locate financialization in terms of the evolution of institutions and the evolution of history, to set the terrain, the broader terrain of it. And we need a mixture of the two. In short, what we need is middle-range theory to understand financialization. The middle-range theory is always the most difficult theory to do, because it's not pure theory where you move with the concepts and the abstract concepts. It's not history where you concretely examine the evolution of events and you theorize them. It's actually an in-between thing, and the in-between things are always the most difficult things to do. But the theorization of a period of capitalism, it seems to me, is by construction and by definition middle-range theory. So if that's the case, what is financialization? Well, I would say financialization is basically 3 fundamental tendencies rooted in capitalist accumulation. Now, I expect that some of you subsequently will ask me, why do we get these tendencies? And I'm prepared to discuss them. But since this is middle-range theory, I don't have to justify or explain where they come from. I simply recognize them. And I validate them empirically. That's enough for middle-range theory, it seems to me. So to me, financialization is 3 fundamental tendencies rooted in capitalist accumulation. The first tendency has to do, here you can see my Marxist outlook, the non-financial enterprises. One must start with the non-financial enterprises, productive and commercial enterprises, the big businesses that make up the bulk of the economy. And when you look at these big businesses, the non-financial enterprises, what can you say about them? Well, it seems to me that what you can say about them are two things which are very important. The first is that big businesses in the last 3 to 4 decades have actually become more independent of banks. There isn't, contrary to what many people think, there isn't actually a coming together of big businesses and big banks in the last 3 to 4 decades. There is actually more and more space opening up between them. And the reason is clear. Big business can finance investment overwhelmingly through retained profits. The ability to finance investment through retained profits is something we observe for a long time in large enterprises. In the last few decades, it's become very clear and very powerful. So big business finances its investment through retained profits. That doesn't mean it doesn't use banks. Of course it uses banks. Of course it has a connection with banks. But its investment is overwhelmingly financed through retained profits, and that gives it independence of banks. So we find space and independence between these two components of the capitalist economy. But at the same time, what we see non-financial enterprises doing is, as they become more independent of banks, they financialize. They become themselves more involved in financial activity on own account. They've acquired financial operations and financial capabilities, and they apply them. They go to market, they undertake financial operations, and they make financial profits themselves. So they financialize. So financialization begins at the level of the non-financial enterprise, which financializes in this complex way that I just summed up. That's the first tendency. The second tendency, I think, has to do with banks, has to do with financial institutions, which obviously have to relate to what happened to the non-financials. And it's clear what the banks would do. The banks remain very much the core of the financial sector anyway. What the banks would do, and they have done, if the non-financials behave in this way, the banks will have to adapt their profit-making. Banks are profit-making businesses. They reinvent themselves constantly. They've always done that in the history of capitalism. And they have reinvented themselves in the last 3 to 4 decades in two ways. The banks have begun to seek profit, not simply from lending to productive enterprises, especially big businesses. They still do that, but that is not where profit-making is at its most successful. The banks have begun to seek profit through transactions in financial markets. It's a shift in the profit-making activities of banks towards profit that comes from transacting in finance rather than lending, fundamentally. And the second thing that the banks have done is to seek to make profits out of lending to households. If you don't make profits, if you can't have good business from lending to big businesses because they finance themselves, then you lend to other people, and other people means households. So the banks have reinvented themselves as financial operators and institutions that aim to lend to households. The third tendency is, in a sense, related to the first two, and it has to do with households and individuals themselves. And what we see there is that households have become transformed in their relation to the financial system. This is, in a sense, the most vivid aspect of financialization historically. What we see is that individuals and households have become more and more closely implicated in the operations of the formal financial system. And they've done so on both sides of the balance sheet, as it were. Households clearly borrow more. The proportion of household debt to GDP in this country and elsewhere it's just gone through the roof during the last few decades. So the households borrow more, but households also have more financial assets proportionately. And that's something we shouldn't forget. We shouldn't just look at debt. Households also have financial assets. Why? It's a sort of typical reaction to say it's because wages and real incomes have been stagnant in the last few decades, and people have to borrow more to maintain levels of consumption. I'll come back to that in a minute. I understand this, and I recognize it, especially in this country where real wages have been stagnant since the early 70s, basically. But I think it's more complex than that. The explanation is more complex than that. It isn't to do simply with the level of wages. It is to do with how households meet their basic needs. Households are not businesses. Households are basically where life is reproduced. And households have got needs for housing, for health, for education, for transport, and so on. Now, how these needs are met depends on the systems and the institutions and history of each country. There are modes of provision. Historically, we've had public provision to a certain extent. But in the last 3 to 4 decades, with the rise of neoliberalism, public provision has been retreating. In different ways, in different countries, but retreating. What has been taking its place is private provision. Private provision of health, private provision of education, private provision of all these fundamental things. Finance has emerged as the mediator of private provision. Financialization then is a complex phenomenon. It has to do with private finance emerging as the mediator of new modes of private provision to households. And this also includes the asset side, because we see it on the pension side and on the insurance side. As private provision of pensions and so on increases, private finance emerges as the mediator of these services. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that private finance mediates these needs of households, both on the debt side and on the asset side, and makes profit out of both ends. Households have become fields of profit making for finance. Households have financialized in that way. So these three trends, these three tendencies to me are basically the foundation of financialization. That's what I understand by financialization. And these three tendencies, I would argue, you can observe with differences, and I will come to it in a minute, across mature capitalist countries. Now, having said this, this in a sense is the rootedness of the phenomenon in accumulation, in a sense, real economic processes, as I've summed them up. But I also indicated that as middle range theory, we need to locate that in a historical and institutional framework. What is that historical and institutional framework? Now, by construction, you cannot generalize about that. It varies from country to country. However, some generality is possible. And there I would identify 3 elements which are important in understanding financialization. The first is that when we look at mature countries, mature capitalist countries in the last 3 to 4 decades, we can recognize 2 related things that have stamped their aggregate performance. The first is continuing difficulties of profitability. If you look at real accumulation, you will see that there are continuing difficulties of profitability, and associated with that, profound difficulties of productivity increase. The period of financialization has been a period of weak profitability or problematic profitability and weak productivity gains. Productivity has not increased as rapidly as it has done in past periods of capitalist transformation. It's a strange aspect of financialization. You should be very clear about it, because this is the period of profound technological change. This is the period of the introduction of the information technology revolution, telecommunications revolution, that has transformed life and has allowed finance to grow so ferociously. And yet we don't see a beneficial impact or an equivalent beneficial impact on profitability and on productivity growth. Productivity growth has been consistently weak when we look at that. That's fundamental to financialization. Second, and related to that, is of course a monumental rise of inequality. Financialization should be understood as a period that has been shaped by a monumental rise of inequality. What explains inequality is never easy to put your finger on. And I don't propose to do it in in 2 minutes. Piketty has just produced a massive volume on this, so I'm not going to steal his thunder in about 10 seconds. But I would say that there is no doubt at all that financialization has witnessed a historic reversal of the trends of inequality. We've had the inequality return to levels of the interwar years, and this is inequality that has increased both in terms of income inequality, but also functional inequality. In other words, capital has won against labor, or labor has lost against capital, pretty much across mature capitalist countries. Finance has been important in this in ways that I will point out in a minute. And the third element of historical and institutional change, which is important here, is of course deregulation. Deregulation of the labor market and deregulation of the financial markets. A change of laws, practices, and regulatory constraints on the operations of these markets, which have shaped the period of financialization, which has given it this particular character and outlook. Now, financialization then is these three tendencies for me within the confines of weak profitability and productivity growth, rising inequality, and deregulation of a variety of markets, the labor market being key and financial markets being just as important. Now then, what else can we say about this period that would have meaning for understanding the current situation? I can say many things, but I haven't got very much time. So I will point out just three aspects which seems to me matter for where we are and what we can do about it. The first is, in a sense, the rise of new relations of power and hierarchies in the global economy as a result of financialization. The rise of a new imperialism, if you want to call it that. Why and how? The way I've defined and summed up financialization for you now relates to mature capitalist countries. And I said that many times. I make no bones about it. This relates to the US, the UK, Germany, Japan, France, countries at that level of development, the historic centers of capitalist accumulation. Within those countries, you can still find differences, of course. And in this book of mine, I acknowledge the differences. You find, on the one hand, for instance, the Anglo-Saxon countries, the US and the UK, where financialization isn't quite the same as for Japan and Germany. The role of households, for instance, in the Anglo-Saxon countries is more pronounced than in the case of Japan and Germany. You find, in other words, the historic distinction between market-based finance in Anglo-Saxon countries and bank-based finance in Japan and Germany maintaining itself in a way and reproducing itself in the period of financialization. Nonetheless, you can find financialization across the board. There is no doubt that Japan and Germany and France and so on are also financializing, with differences. So that much is clear. But that is still a process that comes out of the mature countries, the historic centers of capitalist accumulation. What's been happening in the developing world? This is a new development, in a sense, and a lot of my students are looking into it because that's a process that began to take shape really the last 15 years or so. And in a sense, we can see the true power of financialization by putting our finger on that development. And what we see is financialization emerging across a range of middle-income countries now. We see financialization emerging in Brazil, in Turkey, in Mexico, and in countries which you wouldn't call middle income as a whole, but they've got a middle income country within them, like India or countries of that magnitude. We definitely see financialization processes occurring there too. Those of you who might have studied developing countries will know immediately what I mean in terms of the growth of the financial sectors of these countries in the last 10, 15 years. Now, how are we to understand that? I would argue that this is actually derivative or subordinate financialization. This is financialization that follows and is generated by financialization occurring in the mature countries of the capitalist system. One key way in which this happens and shows you the global reach of financialization is, of course, capital flows. Now, historically, we look at capital flows as a process that takes place from the mature countries, the advanced countries, as it were, to the developing countries. Capital crosses borders and goes to these countries in search of profits, be it from production or from other activities. No doubt, this has been going on in the last 15 years with foreign direct investment reaching and sustaining very high levels the last decade and before. If you net it out, you will see that that's not the case, however. If you net it out, you will find a very strange phenomenon. You will find that capital has actually been flowing from the poor to the rich. It might sound strange to you, but that's actually what's been happening. And the reason why capital has actually been flowing from poor to rich on a net basis is because, of course, the poor have been accumulating reserves of dollars, essentially. Fundamentally dollars or sometimes euros. But to accumulate reserves of dollars, you've got to buy US government securities. That's how you hold your dollars. In other words, you send money from India to the United States. This is state-to-state transactions. These are not private agent transactions. But they're state-to-state transactions that are generated because of the logic of the global financial architecture, as it were, and the private capital flows that go from the US to India, say. If you net it out, the US is the beneficiary on a net basis. It receives capital. Why? Because of the role of the dollar. What's the impact of that as far as financialization is concerned? The country that receives the flows, the US in this case, but not only, but mostly the US, obviously can proceed with financialization because these are extra capital flows that can maintain a bubble or sustain the bubble going, keep the bubble going as it happened from 2004 to 2005 and so on. That's well understood. But what's more interesting is what's happening in the country that sends the money. Brazil, South Africa, and so on. What happens there is that the central bank of that country has to sterilize the reserves, has to make sure that the reserves do not produce inflation. And therefore, he has to create new assets, new financial assets, that allow the country to keep reserves without runaway inflation. These new financial assets are usually very liquid. Domestic assets, highly liquid assets. The domestic financial institutions acquire these assets, and then they can expand their balance sheets. So what happens is they begin to financialize. In which direction? In the direction that the new banks, that the banks coming into these countries from the mature countries teach them to do. So what you get is mature country banks that come from countries that have financialized, that know how to lend to households, that know how to play the games in the financial markets, which are summed up for you to start with, go to middle-income countries and train the banks in those countries to play the same game, which now have liquid assets which allow them to do it. It's a little more complex than that. I'm summarizing it ferociously and brutally, but I want to give you the gist of it. The end result is that you get middle-income country financialization proceeding in leaps and bounds with phenomena which actually look sometimes worse than the phenomena of the mature countries when it comes to households. Incredible increases in household debt occurring in places like Turkey, in places like Brazil, in places like India, as a result of processes of this type. So this is financialization occurring in a subordinate way, a derivative way across the world because fundamentally of the role of the dollar and because of the role of the banks of mature countries. I would argue that this is the form that imperial relations, hierarchical relations will take the day, and we need a far better understanding of them than we've got at the moment. So that's the first aspect of financialization I want to mention to you. The second aspect that I want to mention to you is what it has done, financialization, what it has done to social structure. And here I will refer to mature countries, although the phenomena that we see in middle-income countries, developing countries, are actually beginning to look pretty similar. What we see in mature countries as a result of financialization of the last 4 decades is, of course, a transformation, profound change in social structure for 2 related reasons. The first is the rise of financial profit. Financial profit has become, especially in this country for which we've got the best data, has become an incredible proportion of total profit. Absolutely incredible proportion of total profit. And that's without counting financial profit that accrues from personal transactions or for payments to bank functionaries and so on. This is simply counting the profit of financial institutions. Okay? Financial profit, I would argue, is a very important part of financialization. Financial profit is not like other forms of profit. It's not like industrial profit. It's not like commercial profit. Financial profit can also be a zero-sum game. It can also be simply a transfer from someone's income into someone's profit, a transfer from someone's money wealth into someone else's profit account. It has this dimension to it which industrial profit doesn't. So I would argue that this is an element of financial expropriation which characterizes financialization, and it gives the basis for the growth, the extraordinary growth of financial profit that we've witnessed the last 3 to 4 decades. Now, who benefits from this financial expropriation and the growth of financial profit? In the past, and sometimes now among post-Keynesians, you hear an argument that financialization is the triumph of the rentier. The rentiers used to be this social class, this social layer that basically lived by owning capital, which you would make available for lending, and you would survive on the coupons, right? On the interest that you would receive from it. And if inflation was fairly steady and the rate of interest was reasonable, then you could live on it if you had a significant amount of capital. So you could be a capitalist that you would survive without actually applying your capital to production. The rentiers in typical political economy analysis would be considered parasites. You can see why. You don't do anything productive. You simply own capital, you make it available to others, and you live on the interest. I don't see this class today. I don't see, well, obviously I see individuals who do that, but I don't see that social layer as the dominant layer of financialization. Financial profit, which is huge, doesn't really accrue to a rentier class in my view. It accrues to a different layer which needs better analysis. If we have rentiers today, they are a very strange sort of rentier. They are rentiers who basically draw enormous profit because of location and position in the financial system, because of location and position in the productive mechanism, commercial and industrial enterprises, and relation to the financial system. There are people who work for banks, people who work for large financial institutions, people who run big businesses and get remunerated in financial ways through financial instruments. And you end up making vast profits in the form of salaries and wages. It appears as a bonus, which is a payment for your labor. It isn't labor at all, it's actually profit, but it accrues in this form. It doesn't accrue as interest. And therefore, it defines a social stratum which has benefited from financialization, but it isn't a rentier stratum in the traditional way. This social layer, I would argue, has been extremely successful at capturing the policy-making process, at influencing the policy-making process, and it's shaping economic and social policy in ways that protects its ability to extract this kind of profit, its ability to receive this kind of profit, and that's characteristic of financialization, I would say. The last thing I want to mention, I'm running out of time fairly rapidly, is the third thing about financialization that's worth discussing is, of course, what it has done to ideology, the ideological shift that it represents. That's very, very important, and I want to say a few words about it. I haven't got time to expand on it much as I would have liked to, but I'll say a few things about it. What we see in the period of financialization is, of course, the rise of neoliberalism. There's no doubt at all about it. Neoliberalism is the dominant economic ideology of our era. Neoliberalism is a very strange kind of ideology. It's now so dominant. You find it in so many economics departments. People survive and use it without knowing what they're doing. They think that this is economics, so they think that this is thinking. Well, it isn't thinking. It's a certain type of thinking that has a strong ideological dimension to it, right? In this country, which has been one of the main sources of neoliberalism, it has a very strong outlook of presenting economics or economic and social analysis as a conflict between the state and the market. It's very, very clear to me when I read US material or when I read the press and so on. It's sort of strongly embedded ideological thing. There's a conflict between the market and the state, and the neoliberals are presumably the ideology that says the market is good, the state is bad, and so on. Neoliberalism is not about that. Neoliberalism is not an ideology that's against the state. That actually is, in a sense, introductory neoliberalism. In truth, and here I agree with Mirovsky's argument in his latest book, neoliberalism is about capturing the state and aiming to use it in order to change economy and society according to neoliberal precepts. It's actually an ideology that, in a sense, likes the state and wishes to use the state. It isn't against the state. And that's something which we've seen very clearly when it comes to finance. Because you won't find neoliberalism more openly manifested than in the realm of finance. And you won't find the state more openly loved and depended upon than in the realm of finance. When it comes to trouble, finance always turns to the state and depends on the state, as I will explain in a minute. So the first ideological dimension of financialization is to have the rise of neoliberalism. For me, neoliberalism is the ideology that's most appropriate to financialization as an era, as a period. What's even more stunning, though, here is the ability of this kind of ideology to penetrate so many aspects of social and private life, to reach into all kinds of nooks and crannies of personal life, individual existence, social life, professional life, to shape mentalities, to shape outlooks, to create a certain approach to life and work, which we find so dominant in the world today. It is to calculate everything in pennies and pounds or in dollars and cents. It is to translate everything into money worth. It is to think that all social values and all social principles can be translated into dollars. And that's how one should measure them and assess them. That, in a sense, is the most pernicious aspect of the ideological shift that we've seen in the period of financialization, emanating from finance to a large extent, and in a sense permeating and polluting society, because it's a kind of pollution, really, as far as I'm concerned. At the same time, and I haven't got time to go into it, I must acknowledge that there are large sections of society that have been resisting this, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Nonetheless, you see the tendency emanating from the dominant sectors of economy and society. Now, I don't have time to go on for much longer. I've already spoken for about 30 minutes or so. Have I?
Longer.
Longer, really? so I promise to be faster. What I really want to focus on and finish my talk with is the state. Looking at the state, because when we look at the state, we can work out what we can do about this phenomenon that I've been talking about. So when we look at the state of financialization, I think what we can say is that the first thing we need to say is that financialization, the way I've outlined it, is not really a spontaneous development. I say this because when you do mainstream economics, or when you do political economy with a certain disposition, you always want to essentialize things. What I observe has come out of some kind of deeply hidden sort of core. No, that's not the case as far as I'm concerned. Financialization, yeah, it's deeply rooted, but it would have been impossible without the state. The state has made financialization possible. This financialization depends on the state. And it depends on the state in a variety of ways, which I haven't got time to go over it in detail, but I'll sum it up for you. Financialization depends on the state because the state has retained and actually strengthened its monopoly command over the final means of payment, over money. Modern money is created by banks, of course. It's privately created credit money. But this modern money is not convertible into anything of value. The final means of payment is basically another form of credit money created by the central bank, backed by the state. It depends on the say-so of the state. The state has retained this monopoly of a legal tender and actually strengthened it. It hasn't actually conceded that at all. And I say this because if neoliberalism goes true to its ideological core, it should have wanted, like Hayek said, a free market in money. Money is the most important commodity, right? If you got free markets in everything, then you must have it over money. And as I say, Hayek knew that. Friedman didn't. Friedman didn't want it because, in some ways, he was a Keynesian. But Hayek understood. Hayek understood, and he wanted a free market in money, which is logical, right? Do we have a free market in money? No. When it comes to money, the bottom line is complete monopoly. The state has retained monopoly of a legal tender because that's fundamental to running financialization. Without that, it would have been impossible to financialize because, point number two, the central bank wouldn't have had the power it has. The reason why the central bank has got the power it has is because of state monopoly over money. State monopoly over money delivered through the central bank gives to the central bank the ability to create liquidity, which is basically a socially based means of payment. That's basically what it is. When Mr. Bernanke or whatever creates, I should say Professor Bernanke, creates liquidity, this liquidity basically rests on the trust created by the American people. That's what it is. It's socially based liquidity. That gives to the central bank the ability to support banks and to affect the rate of interest. In other words, it rests on a monopoly that the state has maintained over money. So that has been critical to fostering financialization and defending financialization at critical moments. The state, finally, has been fundamental to financialization through regulation and deregulation. And I want to say a few words here as I'm wrapping it up. It's often thought that the years of the last 3 to 4 decades, the years of financialization, have been years of deregulation. In some sense, it's true. I said it myself. The financial markets have been deregulated. All sorts of regulation have been lifted. However, if you look at regulation in the round as a whole, you will see that the last 3 to 4 decades have not actually been years of deregulation, but years of re-regulation. We've had regulation up to the eyeballs in the last 3 to 4 decades. That's the truth of it. There's been stacks of regulation. Financialization, in other words, has depended on regulation. There's been plenty of regulation. The question is, what kind of regulation? And here we see that the regulation we've had has been regulation that's been semi-public, not quite public, but semi-public. In other words, operated by institutions that are and are not public. focusing on the individual activities of financial institutions, and above all, aiming to protect the profit-making capabilities of these institutions. This kind of regulation is captured most clearly in the Basel agreements, Basel I and II, and now Basel III under construction. That's precisely what these agreements have been about, and in a sense, that's the kind of regulation that is being debated right now following the crisis of 2007-2009. A new bout of regulation of this type, which is actually regulation that we might call market conforming. It's the kind of regulation that the financial institutions like because they run it. They produce it themselves, they shape it themselves, and they put it in operation themselves in a semi-public way, and it protects their profits in the medium term. So the state then has been operating regulation in this way. We've had plenty of regulation of this type in the years of financialization. We've also had regulation of a more generic type. I will call it regulation, and it might surprise you, but it is a kind of regulation. And this regulation has taken the form of lender of last resort intervention. That's a kind of regulation too. Essentially, you change the rate of return by intervening in that way. Regulation that, intervention that has been, that has decisively protected deposits. Deposit insurance, it's a kind of regulation, and that's fundamental to financialization. And of course, regulation that has taken the form of having banks and other institutions that are too big to fail. So, lender of last resort, deposit insurance guarantees, too big to fail, key ways in which the state has supported and sustained and created financialization. In sum then, financialization is a period in which capitalism has been transformed, a new transformed type of capitalism has emerged, a deeply exploitative system, a system that exploits in complex ways directly through income and other transfers. It's deeply unequal. It's prone to bubbles and crises. It's a highly unstable system. There's no two ways about it. It's been a period of successive crises the last 3 to 4 decades, emanating from finance and putting the rest of the economy in deep trouble. What can be done about it? And in the next 5 minutes, I'll tell you what to do about financialization. What can be done about it? Seems to me that financialization is not like other historical periods of historical transformation. When you come from a political economy background, when you come from you accept Marxist precepts and so on, you always look at capitalism as something that is a system that produces, in a sense, development, growth, and progress, and you maintain some elements of that, and you aim to transform it into something that's socially beneficial. Not financialization. The social benefits from being able to set derivatives prices across the world in sections of a second are negligible. There is no social benefit that I can see in hiring very high quality physics PhDs to play games with interest rate derivatives. Financialization must be reversed. Right? This is one of these evolution phenomena that must be reversed. So the argument must be the reversal of financialization. But how? What does that mean? Well, we obviously need regulation. Regulation is important, but this kind of regulation must have teeth. It mustn't be the regulation that I've just outlined for you, because we've had plenty of that regulation. So it must be regulation with teeth. So what should this regulation do? Well, it should regulate interest rates, it should regulate credit availability, quantities, and it should regulate the activities, the functional specialization of institutions. It must directly regulate that. It must stop institutions from doing certain things, and it must tell them at which prices and at which volumes to do what they do. The minute you put it in that way, you realize that this is not really possible unless something is done at the global level about exchange rates, of course, and about money being used globally. Because This is now a global system, as I said, and you need to regulate exchange rates. You need to make sure that instability of exchange rates is confronted. You need to do something about the derivatives markets that you get in these prices, which have become enormous. In other words, you need to operate globally to apply this kind of regulation. But regulation alone is not enough. I say this because in this country, a lot of people believe that if you regulate, you will reverse financialization. No. Regulation alone is not enough. Regulation will always be bypassed by private financial institutions. They will develop ways of bypassing regulation. What we need to do is to look at the failures periodically created by financialization. The biggest one is in 2007, 2009, and recognize that these represent the failure of private banking itself and private financial institutions themselves. And that's an argument for public financial institutions. That's an argument for dealing with ownership, not just regulation. Ownership must be confronted as well. Regulation alone is not enough. Essentially, private banking has failed, and it's failed time and again. What is it good for? What does it do, private banking, other than create periodic crises? So ownership must be confronted, and there, I would argue, we need complex arguments about public ownership. Public ownership to deal with financial institutions that can confront the shortages of investment that we see in mature countries, and also the problems of providing credit to households and others in non-problematic ways, in socially acceptable ways, rather than the problematic ways that the private system does. Except that these public forms of ownership must not be simply nationalization. No one argues for simple nationalization. That's past. That's not what we need. We need new ways of effecting public ownership over finance, ways that would be communal and associational, and ways that would create a new spirit of public service through which financial institutions can operate. I will finish by saying that even ownership is not enough. If you think about financialization and what it is, you will realize that you must do something as well about the implication of households into the formal financial system. If financialization must be reversed, then that implication of households into the financial system must also be reversed. Now, how would you reverse that? Well, you've got to start and you've got to go back to where it comes from. And if it comes from the retreat of public provision and the emergence of private provision mediated by finance, that has to be reversed. So reversing financialization also means devising new ways of recreating public provision. Public provision in education. In this country, student debt has become enormous. So public provision in education, public provision in housing, public provision in health, and across a range of activities that matter for the life of households. These are vital steps in reversing financialization, in making private finance do something that might not be so socially destructive as it has been in the last few decades. In short, I would argue, reversing financialization, which is necessary, is nothing less than rethinking, restricting, and restraining the aggressive, unstable, and exploitative private capitalism of our day that has created no end of problems. That is ahead of us, and I hope that some progress is made in this regard in the years to come. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open. Yes?
Okay. My name's John Harris. I'm from the Evergreen Program. And my question is, it sounds like what you're saying is that the real wealth that is making this entire huge financial structure possible is household wealth, ultimately. And public provision of housing, healthcare, et cetera, I think that would account for, that would satisfy to some extent the needs of the households to improve their lives. But there are also other things. For example, buying a bigger house, buying a second home, buying a car, I don't know. So my question is, how can households retain the wealth that they themselves have generated without having to go into debt to improve their lives, again, because apparently it's based on the wealth that households themselves have created?
Do you want to take these individually?
Maybe take a round of 3 questions, and if they have common themes, maybe we can address them like that.
Thank you very much, Professor Lapavitsas. That was a gripping narrative, if also slightly, or quite depressing narrative of what's happened over the past 30, 40 years. And as I understood it, was primarily a narrative about the rise of a financial class. I mean, ultimately, financialization is the rise not just of finance as an abstract entity, but there are groups particularly tied to this development. And I was quite taken by the fact that it's not the traditional rentier class, which has long-run interests in things like low rates of inflation and things like that, but it's actually much more short-term in its perspective. It enjoys things like volatility and high rates of transactions and things like that. But I wonder if there's a way in which the story you told might, in identifying what's been so specific about this period, have given the other exploiters in the economy a bit of a pass, right? I mean, it's true that there is this financial class that's received a large share of the profits and so on, but it's difficult to imagine them as the only exploiters in the economy, the only potential enemies of a social program that would want to, your final words were essentially decommodifying labor to a great extent. I mean, if you had major provision of public goods, like housing and so on, this wouldn't just threaten and impose intense amounts of financial repression on this financial class. It wouldn't just threaten their interests. I mean, it would give labor a much larger share of social and political power. And that would threaten the interest of other exploiters, let's say, who maybe have played less of a role. But as you said, even some of them have entered the financial markets themselves. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about sort of where you think the more traditional manufacturing capital and industrial capital would fall in this story, because one could imagine a certain progressive thing which wants the good capitalists who actually, quote unquote, produce things lining up with working class and repressing finance. But it's a little bit hard to imagine that getting off the ground. And if so, how we would what elements we have to add or subtract from the story if we were to bring them in to the argument?
Hello, my name is Manuel Flores. I actually work in financial affairs here at BU. I want to piggyback a little bit about what he was just saying is the rise of financialization and this neoliberal ideology. How do we see the psyche globally changing? How do we reverse this if it's already flooded the minds of men pretty much, and we have this financial class that's already taken over, and that's pretty much causing this tension and this really wide economic gap globally? I just want to see how long you say like this would change, or how over time or over the years we could actually get some sort of regulation to have this come into effect.
Thank you. So maybe we'll take these first 3 questions now.
I'll take the second one first, and then I'll go to the other 2 because they're connected. The question of social transformation and class differentiation is, in a sense, the most vital question, because obviously, when you do political economy, that's what you want to be looking at. I said it in passing, but you're giving me the opportunity to put it in summary terms. There is historically and traditionally a view of the financial interest versus the industrial interest. And the financial interest often is seen as the rentier class. There is a bit of sometimes it's not clearly specified, but that's a common sort of way of looking at it. You find that among post-Keynesians particularly, but also among Marxists to a certain extent. And there you would tend to say that rentiers actually prevent the industrial capitalists from investing, from making profits, and therefore from creating jobs and everything else. And what you need is regulation to repress the rentier and allow the productive capitalist to do what the productive capitalist does best, presumably. Now, that's not a view with which I agree, and I said there is no rentier class that I can see. And in fact, what we see is the financialization of the productive capitalist. That's why I started with the non-financial enterprise. You see a penetration of financial interests and financial mentalities and financial practices going right to the top of the industrial and commercial enterprises. You see profits accruing to people who run these businesses through financial means and financial methods. And you see the logic and practice of the financial markets penetrating these enterprises. This is very well documented. There's a whole literature on this. Bill Lazonik has done lots of work on this about the transformation of US enterprises in particular. So the class of people who make financial profits are not rentiers, but they can extract financial profit through location and position in relation to the financial system. These are primarily people employed or working with the financial system, no doubt about it. But there are also CEOs. There are also people who don't work in the financial system, who are not bankers, who are not investment bankers, who are not investment advisors, who are actually people who work for large financial and other enterprises, but have got a means of extracting financial profit because of their particular network of relations with finance. They're not rentiers, but they're people who can extract rent-like returns, profit returns, because of the way they relate to the financial system. So I would argue that this is of fundamental importance to what's been happening today. Now, what do you do about it and how do you deal with it? Well, reversal of financialization has to do with that, restraining and reversing the power and the profit-making capabilities of all these people, and therefore changing the balance of the economy. So it isn't an argument about bad finance and good industry. This is an argument about transforming the economy as a whole. So when I said we need public financial institutions, these public financial institutions are necessary also in order to sustain investment. Because the financialization of the non-financial enterprise has actually been accompanied by a period of very weak investment. These people have been financing investment out of retained profits, but have not been investing very much in this country and in other countries of mature capitalism, of financialization. Investment has been very weak. And that's been a key reason for weak performance on the whole. So public financial institutions would actually challenge that too, and they would change the class balance in that way. So this isn't an argument about good finance, good industry, bad finance. It's actually, financialization is much more complex than that. And reversing financialization has to do with changing balance of power and ownership structures for industry and commerce too, not simply finance in this regard. Now, I come to households, which is the first question. I didn't say that the profits come fundamentally from households. I said households have become a key and dynamic area of profit making for finance. Finance makes still plenty of profits from dealing and trading with the productive sector of the economy, with business. There's no doubt at all about it. But households have become a very large part of what finance does in this country and elsewhere. So household wealth makes financial profits possible, and household income makes financial profit possible in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. It's basically a net transfer out of people's income and out of people's money wealth. What do you do about it? It cannot be confronted on an individual basis. Households individually can do nothing about it. You don't have a choice. All you do is just choose which way you're going to place your pension funds, which way you're going to borrow to send your children to university. Individually, you cannot confront it. Collectively, it's possible. But collectively, what it would mean would not be better financial choices, although we could still use public financial institutions that would make funding for college study better accessible. What it would also mean would be public provision of these things. So that would be the way in which households can begin to confront this problem and this issue. And then we come to how to reverse the mindset. If only I knew how to reverse the mindset, I might have started teaching it as well and made this small. I mean, I try to teach it, but it's more difficult than I imagine. How do you reverse the mindset? And how do you change the mindset? It's incredibly difficult. It cannot be done individually. You have a certain outlook towards life and finance and the economy that is created by the environment, by the mechanisms, structures, and institutions of the world that surrounds us. It cannot be overturned through individual efforts. You need collective mechanisms, collective opposition, and you need to take advantage and to use the various spontaneous means of opposition, spontaneous forms of opposition that emerge across society. Ways of using communal money, for instance, ways of using communal forms of finance, for instance. They are not the answer in and of themselves, but they show the readiness of society to devise new ways of doing things that go against the formal financial system. I haven't got a better answer for that. I don't think anyone else does. So that's what I would say.
Right, so we have five questions lining up. I would urge you to be very precise and short. Thank you.
My specialty. As it relates to the emergence of financialization in the middle economies and the imperial natures it's tied to the advanced economies, considering like the deficit hysteria in this country that's dominated for the past 5 years and some of the statements that are coming out of the Federal Reserve recently, what happens when they stop issuing as many securities into the world? It seems like it could be very destabilizing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so still on the topic of the link with middle-income countries, you said that finance in middle-income countries had been quite derivative, but there's one very big middle-income country which can in turn have a global impact in the next few years. Right, and this country, which the PRC, as you all know, is financializing very fast. Say 15 years ago, even at the political level, finance was completely subordinated in China, confined to state-owned banks. The financial system in China is still state-owned, but it's coming to a high point of political influence and is pushing for liberalization. And there's going to be deregulation of Chinese finance in the next few years. It was announced at the plenum in November. The capital account will be deregulated and capital controls will be lifted in 2015 and 2016, according to the governor of the central bank. And the renminbi, the currency, will be increasingly flexible. So wouldn't this, and this brings maybe the whole picture to an even more depressing endpoint, wouldn't the impending deregulation of Chinese finance constitute a new force for a renewed momentum in global financialization, especially as lifting the capital account will create trans-border flows that will be aiming at the countries with deep markets, in particular the US?
Thank you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Fred. I'm an undergrad at the university, and my question's on your point on the financialization of industry. And I think two good examples of that would be Google and General Electric. General Electric, I think now is actually considered a financial services company. And both of these companies sit on piles of cash, and they choose to loan that cash to small businesses or to technology startups instead of sitting on that cash. And my question for you is, isn't that a good thing?
Thank you. Please.
Yes. I still don't understand why you have a problem calling rentiers rentiers. I mean, they are rentiers on steroids. And also, your solutions about public provision of the social services has failed. Has failed in Greece, has failed in the Soviet Union, and I want you to comment on that or rebut this criticism. And also the liberalization of money has also failed in this country. I mean, this country had a liberal money system in the 19th century, and that's what got us to the Federal Reserve in 1913. Also, as far as communal money, we have volunteerism, which is rampant in this country, and it's happening in tandem with financialization. And last but not least, you're attacking, it's very interesting to see a Marxist attacking laborers. Those people that you call, let's say, the accessories to the financialization scheme, they're laborers. Lloyd Blankfein, he's a laborer. Okay, now, the thing with Lloyd Blankfein, okay, he gets a slice of the loaf. And I don't understand why you criticize Lloyd Blankfein getting the slice of the loaf, and you don't focus your criticism on where is the rest of the loaf going. And is that connected with a corporate ideology instead of the financialization? In other words, the financial institutions behave like we told them to do. They are in a Mexican standoff with each other. That's why they freeze the money between themselves. How can we change this Mexican standoff situation instead of vilifying financial institutions for trying to do the best in that realm, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. One last question.
Thank you. It occurs to me that perhaps the level of analysis could be expanded a little bit to include actually the international economic system as a whole and not just in a single country or a single state. So it's not to me just about a single state deciding what regulations to adopt or not, because at the end of the day, I feel that there are certain, conditions created by the structure of finances throughout the world that compel states to behave in certain ways. So, you mentioned equality as one of the issues there. So, equality might be. We might have very high levels of inequality in the United States, whereas a country like France could have better levels of equality. But at the same time, due to the levels of regulation in that country, they may have lower levels of growth and higher levels of unemployment as well. So how do you find that balance? And countries like France and Italy, you see them, basically feel that they have to go that way. They have to deregulate in order to financialize and follow that structure. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's address this battery of questions first.
Let me start with China, which is obviously the elephant in the room. China is not financializing. And that's what's interesting. There is no financialization. I mean, obviously, there's a growth of finance in China. No question at all about it. The Chinese banks are enormous. Chinese reserves are gigantic. But financialization in the way in which I've been discussing it, in other words, something that goes beyond the simple growth of finance cannot be seen in China. China is not financializing. Why? Because of the reasons that have been mentioned already. Because the currency is not international. There are capital controls. Because of regulation. The banks are publicly owned and there are regulations on them. And because of the way in which enterprises, particularly publicly owned enterprises, have been financing themselves. You don't see financialization of non-financials in China in the same way that you see it elsewhere. So China is not really part of the financialization story. It's actually separate to a certain extent. But as was rightly said, it is the really big question. What is going to happen if the controls are lifted and the process of financialization can also start in China in full earnest? It's a prospect I don't really want to contemplate because the sums are enormous. The size of the Chinese economy is very big. The rest of the world is financialized very rapidly. And what might happen if there are floods of money emerging from over there that can also take part in the financial game? It doesn't bear thinking about. However, I don't know that it is as inevitable as was made out in the question in the question that China will go that way. I know that there are pressures for it, but at the same time, I know that China operates under different constraints as well. I don't really know which way it's going to go, but there are reasons to think that the Chinese leadership will not allow the currency to become fully international, will not lift capital controls, it will not deregulate banks and so on, in quite the way that the spokespeople of the big financial institutions in the West expected to. There are reasons to think that there might be regulations that are in place for a while longer. If they're lifted and China begins to financialize, then the nature of crisis that we're going to see in the future will make what we've lived through seem like a little insignificant episode, in my view. So that's what I have to say about China. Now, a lot of the questions were also related to the international financial, system. So I can take them sort of pretty much in conjunction with each other because we're running out of time as well. What happens when QE stops? It was essentially a question that was asked. Well, yeah, ask a variety of middle-income countries what might happen when QE stops, because obviously the process that I've been describing to you, subordinate financialization, will suddenly have significant problems. It will suddenly have to readjust itself because the flows of FDI will become more problematic. You might get a sudden reversal of capital flows, and then the funds that have been accumulated as reserves will not, in all probability, prove insufficient because they're not really that big in many cases. And then there might well be significant financial crisis emerging in places like Turkey, which came very close 2 weeks ago, and in other places which might also come very close, such as India, where financialization has been quite rapid in the last several years, and places like South Africa, which has also financialized in a slightly different way, but he has also financialized. So when QE stops, if it stops suddenly or it stops in a big way, then yeah, serious problems could emerge. And that's a reflection of the hierarchical nature of the global financial system, the subordinate nature of financialization in those countries, the new form in which these imperial relations have emerged in the last 2 decades. Now, there was another question that was asked about other countries that have got the choice of regulating, deregulating, or following the pattern of the US, and lifting regulations in order to grow faster, and therefore reproducing the US path of development. I'll tell you a secret. The US is not the model for growth. It isn't. And other countries are not really trying to emulate the US. There was a time in the 2000s, I used to tell my students in London, and there are many types of financial system in the world, there are bank-based, market-based, and so on. You try and show them in the literature, you couldn't, because really the literature in the 2000s would say there is the modern financial system, by which they meant the US system. And this is what system should be like, because the US system has managed perfectly to combine the stock market with the banks, and that slices and dices risk and prices risk in an optimal way. Do you remember that? Some of you probably weren't about. That's it. That's the modern system. And we've invented it in the US. You were trying to tell the students, actually, it's not like that. They wouldn't listen to you, because why would they listen to you? What do you know? I mean, look at the world. So the US is not quite like this, and those who try to deregulate are not really following the US. They're not trying to recreate the US. And you can see that in the case of Germany. Germany is financializing, but it's not financializing in the same way as the US has done. He has retained industrial capacity, he has protected it, and he hasn't tried to recapture some industrial strength by lowering wages still, and by lowering energy costs through fracking, which is basically what this country has done. The industrial policy of the United States is to lower wages and to lower energy costs and hope for the best. So I don't see that happening elsewhere. Europe has got serious problems. France has got serious problems. But the answer is not to deregulate, and it's not to apply even more neoliberal policies and grow through the growth of the financial system. Since we're talking about the US, incidentally, it seems to me that already there are the makings of a bubble in place. Another bubble is, you know that now, if you look at the stock market, you will see that there are reasons to think that what's been happening there is unsustainable. One reason why the US managed to get out of the last bubble in the way in which it did is because there was no stock market bubble at that time. It was actually a real estate bubble, fundamentally, and the stock market wasn't affected by it. Unlike Japan in the 80s, where he had a combination of real estate bubble and stock market bubble, and the country was nearly finished. What we might be seeing now in the US is actually, in a sense, the second half of that. The real estate bubble has got over with and finished, but now the stock market bubble, a stock market bubble is emerging. We shall see how it pans out, but it indicates that nothing structurally has changed in the United States. In my view, financialization continues. And let me finish by saying a few things about the rentier and about the non-financial enterprises. Because again, this comes back time again. No, these are not rentiers on steroids. Property is important, but they are not drawing the profit. I repeat, they're not drawing their profits because of property and capital. Profits and extraordinary profits are drawn because of position. You get those profits because of where you work, what you are, the bonuses you can claim, and the extra payments you can claim in a financial way. That's not property and capital that gives you those returns. It's actually presumably your job, your skills, your employment. And that appears as a remuneration for labor, and actually was said so, but it isn't. There is no labor that's remunerated at the rate of $50 million a year, right? That is profit, accruing presumably as salary, and presumably for something you do. What exactly you do when you nearly ruined the world, I don't really know, but presumably you're doing something useful. So these are not rentiers on steroids. As far as mechanisms of public provision and so on that have failed, and this is really what I want to say, is this. The notion of the world, a different world in which you provide everything through the state, that has definitely failed. Who wants to go back to that? Right? Nobody wants to go back to that. Nobody wants to have that come about. I didn't say that. Right? The notion that you nationalize everything, you produce the last button in the world through some kind of public enterprise, that's just nonsense. Right? The notion that every hairdresser and every corner shop and every other little agent has to be publicly owned, because that's nonsense, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about public provision of key things that people need, and we're talking about public provision of investment and public intervention in the production of means of production as well, investment goods. Right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about failure of public provision and failure of public enterprise in these fields, and the re-emergence of public ways of doing it. But these public ways of doing it must be novel. They must reflect the modern world. They must reflect what we've learned, what people want. They must reflect communal and associational ways of doing it, and novel ways of dealing with these aggregate economic problems for the future. Take a step back and think about it. How is the housing problem solved? In good measure, through private banks. Because you have to borrow, people have to, and others have to borrow to build houses, you have to borrow to buy a house. So private banks have emerged as a lever for dealing with the housing problem in this country and elsewhere. What do banks know about housing? What is the skill that private banks have in dealing with the housing problem? None. They pretend they know. And they've acquired some business skills there in making profit out of it. But they don't really know the housing problem. They don't really know how to deal with the housing problem of this country. Take education. How is education dealt with? Funding for education. Through borrowing, in other words, through private funding as well, and through private lenders to a certain extent. What do they know about education? I mean, why do they have a skill in doing it? We need public mechanisms for this. That is my point. We need public mechanisms for that. They can be innovative, they can involve finance, but not necessarily private finance. And not private finance that aims to make as big a profit as possible out of these transactions. That is really the issue for today. And when it comes to the last question, which is take Google or take General Electric or whatever it is, which has piles of cash and it begins to lend venture capital or whatever it is that a bad thing? Well, if I'm in receipt of these funds, which I cannot obtain from a bank, I don't think it's a bad thing, obviously, because it allows me to start my business and to do what I want to do and to employ some people and so on. So on an individual basis, if someone borrows in that way, they solve their own funding problem and credit problem if they have one. But clearly that's not the answer to the weak investment problem of the United States and of other countries. That's not the answer. The answer is not, let's have big businesses that make so many profits, such huge profits, that they begin to operate like banks. The business of Google and other enterprises of this type is to invest in production and to invest in what they know how to do best, and how others obtain funding to start production should be dealt through different mechanisms. And I would argue through mechanisms that incorporate a public dimension. That is the issue for today. And how we do it is a matter that requires more thought and more original and innovative ideas. That's what's lacking today, I would argue.
Thank you very much.